Hey guys, Blake Tollefson here. I'm from West Central Wisconsin. Today I'm here to talk about targeting stream trout in streams as well as small lakes and ponds. So why trout fish? Why would somebody even want to trout fish? Well, for me, what I like about trout fishing is that you can make it as simple or as complex as you want it to be. You can go out there with one rod, one reel, small little tackle box, and catch trout, or you can take it to the other level where you're actually dropping a boat into one of these small lakes, have all your electronics, have a deck full of rods, and catch some trout. The other advantage of trout fishing is you can find some solitude. Especially in the COVID era, there's a lot of lakes here that are just getting pounded over and over and over again. And with a lot of these smaller streams and lakes, you can get away from those crowds. Because a lot of these places are off the beaten path or in some smaller remote areas. The other advantage, trout are feisty. They're fun to catch if you've never caught a trout. They pull a lot harder than a lot of other fish species you can find in freshwater, and they make some great table fare. So where are they? Across most of the Midwest, you're going to find them in streams, lakes, ponds, and some larger rivers as well. But for the purpose of today's talk, we're going to focus on both streams and lakes. So we'll go through some different trout finding tools. How do you find these places? Some tools that can help you while you're out there. And then we'll break down what I'm doing differently from a small stream to a small 100, 200 acre lake. So trout finding tools, arguably the most efficient, the best tool, kind of best bang for your buck is simply the DNR website. Especially here in Wisconsin, the DNR has put a lot of time and effort into making sure that all of this information is easily accessible. They have everything from the regulations to maps to stocking information, as well as some other tools that we'll go into. It's kind of your one-stop shop for all things trout. The one downfall, it's a lot more effective to use from a desktop computer than from a mobile device. You can access it from both, but it's definitely a lot more user-friendly on a desktop. So the first tool we'll talk about available from the DNR is the Trout tool. This is the Trout Regulations and Opportunities user tool. So this is great for in the field or for scouting ahead of time. Basically, it's a map that you can access from your mobile device, and it has details regarding the regulations, the stream classification, as well as access opportunities. The other plus, this thing is completely free. One of the other tools you find from the DNR website are simply the county maps. So basically, this is a printable PDF, color-coordinated map. And what this does is it lays out that specific county and highlights all of the trout streams in that specific county, and then highlights them based on classification type. So class 1, class 2, or class 3. They're not as user-friendly when you're in the field, but they're great tools for scouting ahead of time. The other thing that's really helpful that's available from the DNR is the stocking database. Basically, this gives an angler all of the information they need to find out where those fish are stocked, what exactly was stocked in that water body. For example, if I was to look up Beaver Dam Lake in Barron County, I could find out that there was 175 broodstock trout stocked into that lake here just this last May. Some other things that are really helpful, mobile apps. So Onyx Hunt, it's really regarded as a hunting app, but it's a super useful tool, especially if you find yourself in some of these remote areas. You can download those maps ahead of time so you know where you're at in the field. Not only does it show a lot of these public access points, but also gives you information related to landowner names. So if you find yourself somewhere, you don't quite know where you're at, you're trying to get a hold of a landowner, you can at least have some of their contact information available at your fingertips. The one downfall, Onyx does require annual subscription, and I believe it's somewhere in that $100 range, but it's a great tool if you fish and hunt. A relatively new app that's specifically designed for trout fishermen is Trout Routes. So what this app does is it basically highlights all of the streams in the state of Wisconsin or whatever state you might be fishing in, classifies them based on regulations, the stream type. It shows you all of the access points. This is really kind of the best, most user-friendly tool you can access from your phone. There is a free version, but there's also an annual subscription, I believe, that runs about $40, and that gives you a ton more information. So this was designed by trout fishermen for trout fishermen. If you spend a lot of time trout fishing, it's definitely worth checking out. So now what we'll do is we'll kind of break down fishing in a stream versus fishing in a lake. When you think of streams, most people think of trout, and that's for good reason, because a lot of those, a lot of the trout fishing that happens in the Midwest happens in small streams. So in Wisconsin, our DNR here classifies streams into 3 types: Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3. So your Class 1 stream, this is something that's like a super high quality trout water, typically occurs near like the headwaters of a stream that actually does have natural reproduction. No stocking occurs in a Class 1 stream. The one downfall is that a lot of times these are smaller and slower growing trout. Class 2 streams, on the other hand, these are ones that support some natural reproduction, but they're also supplemented with stocking. So basically what the DNR strives to do is to make sure these streams are being used to their full potential or to their full carrying capacity. So these ones do have some carryover of adult trout, and typically a lot of larger fish will come out of these Class 2 streams. Class 3, these are fisheries that you would never expect to be a trout fishery. These are things that are specifically managed via stocking. Like no natural reproduction happens in these streams. And typically there's not a lot of carryover in these streams either. So these are ones that the DNR might manage, specifically as like a put and take fishery. So regardless of the stream that you're fishing in, there's definitely some very specific areas that you can kind of focus on. The really obvious things like a deep pool, a current seam, cut banks, log jams, something that gives those trout some cover, a place to hold outside of that current. Those are all great places to start your search. So when I think of trout fishing, I like to think of Teddy Roosevelt. Be like Teddy. And the reason I say that is because one of Teddy Roosevelt's most famous quotes is, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." That saying applies very well to trout fishing. Trout are super weary, so you want to be extremely quiet, cautious, stealthy, and you want to use the longest rod you possibly can in that scenario. Really watch your shadows and just be cognizant of where you're at in that stream. I only try to be in the water when I need to be. A lot of people think of trout fishing. People are in the stream, they're waiting, but there's not a reason to be in the stream if you're not specifically fishing or you need to do it for access reasons. So only be there when you have to. Other things to take into account, especially when fishing streams, cloudy days oftentimes are better than sunny days. Trout don't have eyelids, they don't wear sunglasses. So basically, you want a reason for them to come out. If it's high sun, a lot of times those fish will be tucked up under a bank or in a log jam, something to try to stay out of that sun. Another factor in a lot of these smaller streams is dry spells can help. Not droughts, but like a little bit of a dry spell where there's not been a lot of food floating downstream, basically making your presentation a little more appetizing to them. A different approach that I take than a lot of people, we have more than 13,000 miles of streams here in Wisconsin, so I just cover as much water as I can. I'm going to fish an area for a little bit at a time, and then I'm going to move on to the next step. I just be efficient. So I'll make 3, 4, 5 casts on a specific area, and then I'll move on to a new spot on that stream. And if things aren't going there, I'm just going to go find a new stream. So on the lure side of things, unlike a lot of trout anglers, I don't use any inline spinners. I have used them in the past, but basically my experience has shown that there's a couple of lures that I like a lot more. That first one here is the Z Spender from Euro Tackle. It's a 2-inch micro little jerk bait, dives, in that 1 to 2 foot range. So it's great for fishing a lot of these smaller streams. And what I've noticed that this helps pick off a lot of those bigger fish initially. My other favorite lure are soft plastics. And this one here is the Euro Tackle B-Vibe. This is a 2-inch paddle tail. And this is tied onto one of my trout rods at 100% of the time. And I'm using this more often than I'm using those hard baits as well. The reason I like that is because you can fish it at variable speeds. You can fish it at any depth just by adjusting your retrieval or by adjusting the size of your jig head. So the rods, when it comes to rods, it wouldn't be fair for me to talk about trout and not talk about the Trout series. This Trout series, a lot of people are very familiar with it, but it was redone last year as well. This new redesigned Trout series, it's a sister series to the Panfish lineup. So if you're familiar with any of the Panfish series, you would be very comfortable with one of these as well. The main difference here is really the handle and then some of the trim that comes on here, making it just a more durable option. And then you also have the advantage of 1, 2, and 3 piece rods. if I was going to pick kind of an all around, especially for the areas I fish, a lot of the streams that I'm fishing have trout in that 8 to 15 inch class. So I'm going to rely on probably a 6'6" light fast. If I was fishing a stream where I had the opportunity for a lot bigger trout, or I want to use a little bit bigger lures, then I would probably push towards that 6'6" medium light instead of the light. Typically, you want to have a shorter rod in your heavy cover, and then you want to have a longer rod if you're more open. When it comes to the reels that I'm pairing with these rods, really you just want to find something that balances well with your specific setup. So in a lot of instances, that's going to be something in the 1,000 to 2,500 class. It doesn't really matter on brand, just find something that works well for you and works well with the rod you're using. On the line side of things, I'm using micro braid. So that is my main line, a 4-pound micro braid. And the reason I like to use that is simply for sensitivity. And then if I'm fishing in any of these, darker streams, it just gives me something to watch, especially watch those line jumps. And then I'm just adding a 4-pound fluorocarbon leader to that, something typically in that 5 to 6 foot range. So on the lake side of things, it's kind of an unconventional way to think of trout. You think of the Great Lakes, you think of some of these bigger bodies of water as trout fisheries, but you don't think of these small little tiny inland lakes as trout fisheries in a lot of instances, especially during the summertime. I think we've all seen on social media where people are targeting trout throughout the winter, but this is my personal favorite time of year to catch these trout, and it's my personal favorite way to catch trout in general. It's a very similar concept to fishing for panfish in a lot of aspects. So if you like panfish, I think you would like this. And the lakes are generally pretty quiet. So earlier in the season, basically when those fish are stocked and the water's cooler, you'll find trout basically all over the place. They're not going to be down at the bottom in 80 feet of water in a lot of instances, but you could find them in 2 feet of water or suspended over maybe that 80-foot hole in that lake. As the water warms up, fish tend to stay in the very upper portions of the water column. Stratification occurs, thermocline establishes, and basically that lower areas have the least amount of dissolved oxygen. So those fish tend to stay in those kind of upper portions of the water column. So when it comes to trout fishing in a lake, obviously you have the advantage of having a boat. So I really like to rely on my electronics. A lot of these lakes aren't mapped. So that's kind of one of the first things I'm doing when I arrive to these places. I'm setting up my unit to make sure I can map everything out as I go. And then I'm still relying on my 2D sonar, my down imaging, and my side imaging. Typically side imaging is a lot more helpful when fish are in shallower. And then as those fish push out to deeper water, I'm relying more on my 2D and my down imaging. We're all familiar with forward-facing sonar. I mean, there's a lot of different options in the market at this time, and they're really advantageous for tracking down trout. From what I've noticed, a lot of these smaller trout that live in these little lakes, they seem to school up and you'll find pods of 5, 6, maybe 10 fish at a time. But when you find these larger fish, they tend to kind of roam around by themselves. And it seems to be a lot more advantageous to actually use this sonar technology to find those specific larger fish. Certainly you control and cover water, but a lot of times what I'm finding is that these little bit larger fish are hanging down below the rest of those smaller ones. And this way you can actually specifically target those. So there's really 2 different approaches I take for targeting open water trout. One of those is trolling, one of those is casting. Trolling, it's boring. It certainly can be, but it's definitely the most effective way to cover water and just strictly catch numbers. It's definitely more of a numbers game than a size game when I'm trolling. And typically I'm trolling these at a speed of 1 to 1.5 miles an hour, which is a little bit more similar to how you would troll for panfish versus like walleyes or maybe trout in the Great Lakes. And I do rely on rod holders a lot. I like to make long casts away from the boat, put those rods in the rod holder, and then loosen my drag. Just let those fish kind of hang themselves when they hook up there. On the lure side of things, I am relying primarily on small crankbaits. In particular, here I have the Z Cranker from Eurotackle. This is a 1.5-inch crankbait, dives to about 4 to 5 feet. And because these trout are hanging in those upper portions of the water column, this is a great tool. It does have some internal rattles. It doesn't dive too deep, but it's not staying up higher like if I was using a stick bait or something like that. when you look at stick baits in this size class, typically they're only going to dive down to 1 or 2 feet. So it gives me a little bit of extra depth using those smaller crankbaits. And in certain instances, I will also troll a small lipless crankbait. Like I have here, so that is a Euro-Tackle Z-Viber. You can get those down to somewhere in that 3 to 4 foot class. Just depends on how fast you're willing to go. Rods, it's a little bit different approach. So really what I'm relying on strictly is the panfish rods. You could get away with a lot of the walleye rods, but why I picked the panfish series, this is made of SE2, so it's a little bit softer material. This is the Panfish Series 7'3" medium light extra fast. The reason I rely on that medium light versus say a light power is because I don't want this rod to be overpowered the entire time I'm trolling. If I was using a lighter powered rod, basically this tip would be loaded up as I'm trolling consistently. Having this medium light power just prevents that from happening. And like I mentioned, that 7'3" medium light extra fast is kind of my rod of choice for these trolling applications. Similar to what I mentioned before, reels, you want to pair that up, based on the rod that you're using. So with that Panfish Series 7'3" medium light extra fast, a 2,000 to 2,500 reel pairs up extremely well with that. And then in terms of line, because I'm trolling, I like using monofilament instead of that micro braid. Just gives you that little bit of extra stretch factor. If you spend any time trolling for trout, it seems like they can get unbuttoned relatively easy. So having that little bit of extra stretch is helpful. Casting, on the other hand, this is not always the most effective, but I found in the time that I've been doing this, this seems to be when I catch the largest trout. But really it's because I can focus on areas that I know where trout are located. So if I'm going out to a fishery for the first time, I'm likely going to spend my initial few hours trolling to try to locate those trout. If it's not mapped, within a couple of hours, I can have a pretty decent map of how that lake is set out. And then if I have a specific area where I've located fish, then I can actually take the time to cast at them. And in my opinion, it's a lot more fun than trolling. So the lures that I'm using, if those fish are staying in the upper portions of the water column, I'll rely on that Z cranker that I mentioned before. So that's that small 1.5 inch crankbait. Dive somewhere into that 4 to 5 foot range. But if those fish are staying on the deeper end of the spectrum, typically I like to rely on something like a swim bait. So very similar to what I'm throwing at those fish if they're in a stream. I'm using just a 2 to 2.5 inch swim bait. And the reason I like that is because I can adjust where I'm fishing in the water column. So if those fish are holding down at 10 feet, I can easily get this bait down to 10 feet below the surface just by adjusting simply my weight or my retrieval speed. So it seems to be a lot more efficient. Another bait that works well in casting applications is, again, that Z-Viber, because you can adjust where in the water column you want that to swim. On the rod side of things, I'm doing things a little bit different. You can certainly use those same trout rods, but really I'm relying on the Legend Elite Panfish 7-foot light extra fast. And the main reason for that is simply because of sensitivity. This is the most sensitive panfish rod that St. Croix makes. It also works great as a trout rod in these specific scenarios. The reason I like that 7 foot or something a little bit longer is you can make longer casts. Like I mentioned before, trout are super, super wary. So just trying to stay away from the boat. And the sensitivity is a lot more important in a casting application than it is in a trolling application. The reel that I have here is a 1,000 size, similar concept to everything else. Pair it up with something that balances well, fits well with the specific application. In terms of line, I'm going back to that 4-pound micro braid and that 4-pound fluorocarbon leader. The reason I like that is because of sensitivity. So there's some other things to take into account whenever you're talking trout. Trout are a lot more susceptible to harm than a lot of other fish species than panfish or bass. So just try to use proper fish care whenever you're working with trout in particular. I always like to wet my hands down before I'm touching trout. They have a little protective slime coating on their outside. So just making sure you're not removing that by wearing gloves or just having dry hands. And then I like to keep the fish in the water in a net as much as possible, especially if it's a fish I want to take a picture of. What I'm going to do is leave it in the net till I can get it unhooked, take that picture, and then let that fish go. And then something that I mentioned last year when I was talking about panfish is being cognizant of how many fish you're taking. One thing to take into account with a lot of these trout fisheries is that they're managed for put and take. It's okay to keep a few. Just keep in mind and be mindful of the type of fishery that you're on. If you're on one of these very special fisheries that has natural reproduction, smaller fish, it's probably a good idea to let those go. But if you're fishing a lake or a stream where these are managed specifically as put and take, it's okay to keep those trout. Don't catch and release is important, and it's it really gets hammered home in the trout industry in particular. But just be cognizant. It's okay to keep a few, especially on those put and take fisheries. If you have any questions, feel free to get a hold of me via Facebook, Instagram. Thank you.